right, good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Chan, and I am the acting director of the University of Victoria's Centre for Studies in Religion and Society, while Paul Bramadat is on sabbatical. It is another beautiful day at the University of Victoria, and I'd like to open this evening's proceeding by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional lands we are holding this lecture series, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who have continuing historical relationships with this land. I'd also like to welcome everyone, whether you are here virtually or in person with us, to our fifth public lecture of the 22-23 academic year. And I'm very pleased today to introduce the first graduate student in this year's lecture series, Catherine Reardon. Catherine is a master's student in history at the University of Victoria and the recipient of the Winifred Lonsdale Graduate Student Fellowship for 2022-23. It's been lovely to have Catherine here at the center so far. We've enjoyed her company, and I look forward to hearing her talk on the different ways that physicians and Reformed Christians perceived and treated witches in early Stuart England. So, Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming today. I am Catherine Reardon. My presentation is called Learned Physicians, Religious Fundamentalism, and the Lull in Witchcraft Convictions, 1630 to 1640. This presentation will be in two parts, as it is important to give you a bit of the background for my current research. Part one is the work I did for my undergraduate honors thesis, and part two is the research I'm currently doing under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Bean. Sorry, something's hung up. This is hung up. It won't do anything for me. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I need to give you a bit of background and how I got started on this research journey. In 2018, I took part in an archaeological excavation in Lancashire, England. And over the course of the 5-week dig, we attempted to find the demolished residence of a family executed for witchcraft in 1612. While doing the readings for the dig, I noted that several historians mentioned a lull in witchcraft convictions in the decades 1630 to 1640 that had never been adequately explained. For my undergraduate honors thesis, I set out to find that adequate explanation for the lull in witchcraft convictions. This is not working, sorry. That's not working for me. So before I, sorry. Yeah, that'll help me a lot. Okay, great. Now, before finding an explanation for the lull in witchcraft convictions, it was important that I ascertained that there actually was a lull in witchcraft convictions. So I created a database of 273 persons accused of witchcraft in England between 1530 and 1720. And since that, then I've added to it, and now there are 870 people on this list. Now, it doesn't take into account Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. From this database, I created a comparison of acquittals, convictions, indictments, and cases where the outcome of the trial was unknown. Blue is indictments, orange acquittals, gray convictions, and yellow is unknown outcomes. And as you can see, although accusations of witchcraft were still high in the 1630s, few people were actually convicted of the crime. And I don't have a pointer, sorry. Now this shows a little more clearly, this is from 1600 to 1680, and the 1680s, and shows more clearly the percentage of those indicted for witchcraft who were then convicted of the crime. And when they were convicted, they were usually executed by hanging. Now this shows there was a clear indication.
When it touches your chin.
Oh, okay. Oh, came off my ear.
It just bends up.
Okay. So there's a clear indication that there was indeed a lull in witchcraft convictions during the 1630s, but also that there was a marked increase in the convictions for witchcraft in the 1640s during the English Civil War and the 1650s interregnum period. Conviction levels did not return to 1630s levels until after the restoration of the English monarchy in the 1660s. Sorry. So I'll give you a bit of an explanation. People in the early modern period really believed wholeheartedly in witchcraft. They used witch bottles and charms from local healers called cunning folk to cure illness and to ward off evil spirits. This charm from 1773 shows that people believed in witchcraft right to the end of the early modern period. And I contend that a lot of people still do believe in it. It was believed that if one did not believe in magic, then one must also deny the existence of God. Magic, God, evil, the devil, angels, and demons were intrinsic to spiritual belief. Satanic influences were everywhere, and they were a common threat to life and well-being. They could cause illness and even death. And Puritan exorcisms were common in England in the late 16th century. However, there were those at the top of English society who disputed witchcraft's power and existence. The late 16th century Church of England heads worried about the rising instances of Puritan exorcisms and the number of witch hunting guides that were published and circulated. In 1584, Reginald Scott, under the patronage of the Archbishop of Canterbury's staff, wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft, in which he claimed that accusers in the witch hunting business were in it for the fortune and fame, and those accused were actually just innocent little old ladies who were lame, blear-eyed, pale, foul, and full of wrinkles. These miserable wretches are so odious unto all their neighbors and so feared, as few dare offend them. James Stuart, King James VI of Scotland, had overseen the Berwick witch hunts in 1590. And in 1597, he wrote a scathing reaction to Scott's work called Demonology in the Form of a Dialogue, a witch hunting guide that influenced witch hunters for many years after it was written. In it, James VI said, "You were an atheist if you did not believe in witchcraft, and witchcraft was real and dangerous." And James gained a reputation as a witch hunter in Scotland. However, James VI also had no patience for, quote, Puritans and rashy-headed preachers that think it their honor to contend with kings and perturb whole kingdoms. In 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England and went from demonologist to defender of those accused of witchcraft. So how did this happen? Many intellectuals from the Elizabethan court, who are now in James I's court, expressed their doubts about the reality of witchcraft. Sir Walter Raleigh wrote in the History of the World for James's son, Prince Henry, advising him that the art of magic is the wisdom of nature. And Raleigh pointed out that men who trained horses were not accused of witchcraft, but women who trained a cat or a dog were accused of training familiars for the purposes of witchcraft. In his book, Silva Silverum, Sir Francis Bacon wrote that the delusions witches held of their abilities were more likely the result of an overuse of henbane, hemlock, opium, and other hallucinogenic substances. Starting in the late 1590s, the upper echelon of the Church of England developed more tolerant attitudes toward witchcraft. The Bishop of London, Richard Bancroft, Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, and future Archbishop of York, Samuel Harsnet, defended women accused of witchcraft. They believed witchcraft cases commonly were due to false accusations, fake symptoms of bewitchment, and neighborhood discord. Their defense of accused witches was not always successful, as judges considered themselves witch hunters. Cleric Samuel Harsnet was particularly scathing in his estimation of the medical abilities of poorly educated English physicians who attributed disease to bewitchment and caused innocent people to be charged with a crime of witchcraft. Most physicians, whether they be locally trained or educated at Oxford and Cambridge, blamed witchcraft for the disease they could not explain, blamed the devil for illnesses they could cure, and blamed witchcraft for accidents from which the injured did not recover. Harsnet, in Egregious Popish Impostors of 1603, bemoaned a lack of respect for the educated, learned physicians for the education learned physicians received and blasted poorly educated English physicians who blamed bewitchment for disease, saying, "See how they discover a devil in epilepsy, mother, cramp, convulsion, sciatica, or gout, and then learn a spell, an amulet, a parrot, a priest, and they shall get them more fame and more money in 1 week than learned physicians do now by all their painful travail in a year." Harsnett and Bancroft called on the Royal College of Physicians member, Dr. Edward Jordan, a physician educated at the University of Padua, to act as an expert witness in the defense of women accused of witchcraft. In a brief discourse on the suffocation of the mother, Jordan wrote that bewitchment was due to hysteria, hormonal imbalance, medical illness or senility, or what we would now refer to as premenstrual syndrome. Jordan explained this as vapors arising from the uterus and that caused symptoms that were frightening to behold. These elite churchmen and physicians worried about King James I's reputation as a witch hunter and sought to educate James on their learned perspectives. So what made physicians like Jordan learned? Why did they think so differently from the doctors who believed in magic and witchcraft? Many fellows of the Royal College of Physicians of London were not educated at English universities, where theology was the first degree before a medical degree was undertaken. They went to the University of Padua near Venice, and at Padua, theological discussion was inevitable. But at Padua, theological influence in the classroom was avoided because students came from all over Europe. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish students alike were there to learn. Their first degree was philosophy, not theology. They referred to recently updated translations of Galenic treatises. In the classic period, Greek physician Galen did not believe in witchcraft or superstition. At Padua, medical students learned logic by experience and experimentation, not just from theoretical treatises. Padua had the first anatomical lecture theater, seen here, and Paduan educated physicians considered themselves better educated than English educated doctors. Edward Jordan testified to this in court, noting that poorly educated English physicians were wrong when they blamed witchcraft for illness, instead of attempting to find the natural cause and cure for disease. Getting back to James I, he considered himself a scholarly king and encouraged his children to take learning to heart. In Basilicandorn of 1599, King James wrote, "Therefore, besides your education, it is necessary ye delight in reading and seeking of knowledge to make you able thereby to use your office. For knowledge and learning is a light burden, the weight whereof will never press your shoulders." James I advised his heir, Prince Henry, to be open-minded, be just, and watch for fraud. Bishop Bancroft, Samuel Harsnett, and Edward Jordan included the king in court proceedings where supposed witches were being tried. They convinced James I that most accusations of witchcraft could be proven to be fraudulent. Mental and physical illnesses, often attributed to bewitchment by those who were superstitious, were actually natural diseases and conditions. So James I went from witch hunter to a king who would facially brand those who falsely accused others of witchcraft. In the king's family were his heir, Prince Henry, who read voraciously and debated with intellectual friends. Prince Charles, the second child, was never meant to be king. He was very sickly, and people thought he had rickets. And he spent a majority of his time with physicians and books. And when Henry died in 1612, Charles inherited both Henry's friends at court and Henry's books. The History of the World by Raleigh, originally meant for Henry, was now a favorite of Charles. And Advancement of Learning by Francis Bacon was still in Charles I's library collection at the time of his death. James I trained Charles in theological disputation, and Prince Charles, despite his later reputation as a terrible king, was a scholarly intellectual like his father, James. At court during James I's reign was another Padua-educated physician, William Harvey, who got the attention of James for his theory on the circulation of blood. And Harvey was a leading physician of the Royal College of Physicians and became physician in extraordinary to James I. In 1625, Harvey was at James's deathbed with fellow Paduan educated physician David Beaton. Harvey became Charles' first physician, but his companion and friend, and they traveled together. Charles provided facilities for Charles's experiments in dissection, and Charles took part in Harvey's scientific investigations. Harvey was extremely skeptical of witchcraft. Fellow physician James Long reported that he had once asked Harvey what his opinion was concerning witchcraft, whether there was any such thing. He told me he believed there was not. Harvey shared his learned opinions with Charles I regarding witchcraft. And the two were so close, and William Harvey so trusted that during the English Civil War, Harvey was put in charge of future kings Charles II and James II. Toward the end of James I's reign, the head of the Church of England and some courtiers took on an anti-Calvinist, anti-predestination stance and adopted rather a philosophy of universal grace, whereby it was no person's place to judge on earth whether another was to be damned to hell or their soul saved. Only God could judge a soul worthy of salvation or damnation. Supposed witches' souls were included. Some of those in this anti-Calvinist circle were Archbishops Laud and Neil and royal favorite Georges Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. It is unlikely that these religious guides to the royal family did not impact the royal view on witchcraft. So James I went from witch hunter to a defender of those accused of witchcraft. Intellectuals and royal physicians did not believe in witchcraft, and anti-Calvinists were reluctant to judge the witch's intention. But accused witches were still being tried and found guilty. Why? And how did this change to bring about a lull in witchcraft convictions? Now, there are too many issues to go into here, but during his reign, Charles I in Parliament did not see eye to eye. And Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629 and implemented his personal rule. Personal rule was an attempt to shape the attitudes of his subjects to mirror his own. He believed he was acting for the common good of his people, and Charles's principles and priorities were imposed upon all aspects of government. He became sole director of the country. However, he still did not have unfettered control of local hinterland governance or local law courts. And Charles noted rife corruption. The more people were tried and convicted, the more money local magistrates made. In ecclesiastical courts, where witches were tried, there was no adherence to English common law, which stated a testimony of 2 witnesses was needed for conviction. Fama publica, a bad reputation, could get a conviction, and no evidence was gathered. Although torture was technically unlawful, trial by ordeal was used. For instance, sleep deprivation was used to encourage confession and the naming of others who might be witches. If the accused was found innocent, those who accused them would have to pay court costs, and therefore it was considered better to get a conviction. So to deal with this corruption, Charles implemented his Book of Orders. This was a term for a series of edicts between 1630 and 1633 that allowed Charles I to bring his personal rule to fruition. In certain statutes written by the College of Physicians, they provided a detailed instruction for physicians for the care of the poor and indigent and brought a reduction to abject poverty. In the Book of Sports, legislated feast days off for workers, thereby overruling landlords' unilateral control of labor. And orders and directions abolished corruption in courts, and courts had to adhere to common law. In historian Brian Quintrell's view, the Book of Orders can be assigned some kind of modest responsibility for the deterioration of the king's political fortunes. So how were witchcraft convictions reduced by orders and directions? Charles replaced Calvinist archbishops with archbishops who agreed to his belief in universal grace. The archbishops appointed bishops who also agreed with this philosophy. The bishops replaced witch hunting judges who died of old age with judges who were willing to comply with royal will. Charles required in orders and directions that all local law enforcement report to royal commissioners monthly. And Charles threatened local law enforcement with loss of position if they continued with corrupt trials and if they did not acquiesce to the king's will. So how did this work in witchcraft trials? In the second Lancashire witchcraft trial of 1633 and 1634, there was one accuser and 19 people accused of witchcraft. They were convicted in Lancashire court by local magistrates, but this was brought to the attention of the king, and Charles had William Harvey and his staff examine the accused, and they determined the accused were not indeed witches. Charles I himself interviewed and pardoned the accused, and those who accused them were charged with fraud and bribery, and so it went through the 1630s. So I concluded that Charles I's beliefs and policies that led to a lull in witchcraft convictions from 1630 to 40 were the product of the influence of skeptical ecclesiastical, intellectual, and medical elite at the royal court of the Stuart monarchy. However, this lull in witchcraft convictions did not last. Due to Charles's unpopular personal rule, civil war was waged between 1642 and 1649. Charles I lost control of much of his country, and in areas controlled by parliamentarians, witch hunting and witchcraft convictions exploded, producing a huge spike in executions. The royalist victories were attributed to witchcraft sometimes, and many women in royalist camps were executed. Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins brought up to 200 people to the gallows. The lull in witchcraft convictions was over, as you can see here again in the 1640s. It all sounds so simple, doesn't it? People around the crown influenced the king's opinion on witchcraft, so Charles I changed the laws and brought witchcraft convictions to a near standstill. But that didn't last. Why? Didn't the English people think abolishing executions for witchcraft was a good idea? This is where my master's thesis comes in. Someone recently asked me, why study witchcraft? After all, hasn't it been studied to death? What more is there to do on the subject? In 1977, historian Alan McFarlane explained that witchcraft was important to early modern people. It may not matter much to us, but it most certainly mattered to them. The study of witchcraft allows us to apply anthropological and cultural theory to historical data. And the study of witchcraft provides a window into the mentalities of the early modern period. As historian Elizabeth Lane Friedel more recently pointed out, medicine and by extension physicians were also important to early modern people. Everyone needed a physician or at least a medical practitioner of some kind at some point in their lives. Medicine and witchcraft overlap because people believed witchcraft caused death and disease, and they needed physicians to identify and cure those diseases. Now, a mountain of past historical research has been done on both the intellectual atmosphere of the Stuart court and the ecclesiastical schism that separated the Church of England from the so-called Puritans in England before the English Civil Wars. However, few historians have undertaken an in-depth study of the influence of the court physicians and how their opinions on witchcraft may have contributed to societal unrest. Canadian historian Gary K. Waite has written extensively on witchcraft-induced tension between 16th century European physicians and Reformation religious factions, but has not included early Stuart England in his studies. Elizabeth Lane Friedel, a leading historian on English physicians in the Tudor and Stuart courts, has not waded into the mire of their controversial opinions on witchcraft, and I hope to fill this gap. In 2016, Frank Ankersmit wrote that different aspects of a subject were determined by the perspectives from which they are seen by the historian. In the case of learned physicians' perspectives on witchcraft, the historical representation and subsequent reinterpretation of the history of medical thought on the subject of witchcraft has evolved over the last 100 years. I never thought I would be thinking about how people thought about how people thought. By the early 20th century, physicians and psychologists sought to record the foundational knowledge of medicine as a scientific field. They misrepresented early modern medicine's perspective on witchcraft by viewing it through a modern scientific lens and created chronological positivist fictions of skeptical medical empiricism too early in the history to be accurate. More recent scholarship, like that published earlier this year by Michael Stolberg, has recognized that late 16th century physicians in Europe employed syncretic combinations of religion, magic, and empiricism in an effort to heal their patients. So historians in the 21st century are starting to recognize that cultural perspectives entered into medical thought, and medical thought infused the religious perspectives on witchcraft. So my research questions from my thesis are, by what process did royal physicians come to be skeptical of witchcraft? What did the people of England think about the physicians' skepticism and their influence on the Stuart kings? Was there pushback to the writings of these physicians? And if there was an adverse reaction, from whom did it come and why? What was the result of this tension between the physicians and those who questioned their learned opinions on witchcraft? And to answer these questions, I need to go back to the beginning of Reformation England, Reformation religion in England, and back to the beginning of the notion of the learned physician. I need to find out how medicine and religion in England overlapped and where they differed. The only way for me to truly understand what happened was to start at the root and track the genealogical trees of medical and reformed religious groups within English society. I needed to understand the process through which the learned physicians developed their skeptical international fellowship. In the late 16th century, physicians such as the Dutch Johann Weyer began to defend those accused of witchcraft as an expression of Christian mercy, but were countered by scathing responses that quoted scriptural direction for the prosecution of witches. And witchcraft accusations in Europe did not fall as physicians hoped, but rather increased toward the end of the 16th century. A move away from the belief in magic as both cause and cure for illness was not sudden among learned physicians. Over the course of the 16th century, these learned physicians evolved through education and exchange of ideas. Johann Weyer was well known in England and inspired Reginald Scott to write his anti-witch hunting treatise. Unlike most other English physicians, they were trained through theology and apprenticeship. Learned physicians in England leaned toward natural humanist means of healing and rejected the use of prayer, fasting, and magic, means of healing entrenched in English medicine. In England, the learned physicians' influence at court was multi-generational. From the time of Henry VIII, Paduan educated physicians were royal physicians, and they both established and dominated the Royal College of Physicians of London. English monarchs supported leniency in the Witchcraft Act that stipulated punishments for the crime of witchcraft, a stance Reformed Protestants found untenable. In the late 16th century, the debate on witchcraft's power to inflict harm raged on concurrently with a rise in skepticism and a corresponding rise in English Puritan exorcisms. Learned physicians believed those accused of witchcraft were not dangerous and deserving of execution, but were to be pitied and treated for mental and physical illness. As we have seen, these physicians contributed to a change in political will, an amendment in law that saw those accused of witchcraft set free and culminated in the lull in witchcraft convictions that came in the 1630s. But I needed to understand why English Reformation Protestants continued to feel so passionately that witchcraft should continue to be a capital offense. Their belief in and fear of witchcraft was tangible and drove them to publish polemical pamphlets and books warning against the influence of those who did not believe in witchcraft. Many of these authors were evangelical doctors. So in the field of history, we analyze cause and effect. While we as historians know that the history we create through research cannot hope to paint a perfect picture of the people and events of the past, we must make the attempt to recreate history as accurately as possible. Frank Ankersmit also tells us that a misrepresentation of historical events may perpetuate skewed historical narratives and thus produce histories that would be completely unrecognizable to those who lived them. Therefore, along with trying to understand the cause and effects of events, we must also consider the perspectives, no matter how foreign to us, of the people who lived in the past and cultural and individual responses to stimuli, particularly if those stimuli produce visceral, emotional group responses. Now, for me, Jürgen Habermas's public sphere theory has helped me at least begin to get my head around the chasm in understandings between the learned physicians and the Reformed Protestants. In 1962, Habermas noted that different groups of people that developed their own in-group systemic versions of truth over long periods of time eventually come to intrinsic universal understandings within that group that differ in terms of logic and reason than that of other groups. These understandings are so entrenched in group thought processes that group members actually cannot see validity and truths and understandings of other groups and systems. When presented with different lifeway understandings, they are very resistant to the adoption of other group truths, no matter how rational, logical, or reasonable the justification for those truths. Quoting Barbara Faulkner's explanation of Habermas, a continued internal discourse in the moral domain aims at universal consensus and is governed by the principle of universalization. Moral discourse is oriented toward norms and values and aims at rational consensus of all persons, while political discourse orients toward the legitimacy of laws and aims at the consensus of all citizens of that community. In early Stuart England, both the learned physicians and Reformed Protestants had essential beliefs and understandings regarding witchcraft that both disallowed and disavowed the other perspective. Each thought the other group was wrong-minded and ill-informed. There was a gaping chasm between that which learned physicians believed were logical explanations for illnesses and supposed witchcraft, and that which Reformed Protestants believed were logical explanations for those same illnesses and perceived cases of witchcraft. Both perspectives were deeply intrinsically valid to those who held them. Both perspectives were essentially inconceivable to the other sphere of understanding, and the king was on the side of the skeptics. So, what happened as a result of this ideological divergence? A perception of good versus evil arose in the Reformed Protestant community. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, learned physician Edward Jordan, while acting as an expert medical witness in witchcraft trials, attributed supposed bewitchment to natural disease. The publication of his book, The Suffocation of the Mother, in English, caused a palpable level of anxiety. This was illustrated by Reformed Protestant doctor Stephen Bradwell in his response to Edward Jordan's assertion that witchcraft was not the cause of disease. Dr. Jordan cannot come to quit himself of certain unworthy corruptions, nor to justify his calling thereto, nor conscience therein. We would, in fear of God, advise him to be more circumspect hereafter than in this business, to discern with whom the truth standeth, lest he be found to fight under wrong's colors. And here Bradwell quotes Psalms 139, 21 to 33. Do I not hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? And do I not earnestly contend with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with an unfeigned hatred, as they are my utter enemies. Bradwell believed that if he and other Christians did not speak out against Jordan's quote unquote malignant mind, they were derelict in their Christian duty. Although Jordan was never physician to the king, he became physician to King James's wife, Anne of Denmark. Like Jordan, over 100 English physicians were educated at the University of Padua between 1485 and 1685, and many went on to be physicians to the royal family. They controlled the Royal College of Physicians and acquired a reputation for being rather godless, a charge against which some of the Paduan physicians, such as Thomas Brown, defended themselves. As mentioned in part 1, King James's stand on witchcraft was tempered by his attendance at witchcraft trials with the learned physicians between 1603 and his death in 1625. Witchcraft convictions began to fall under James I. In 1616, John Cotta, in a book dedicated to the Chief Justice of England, Edward Coke, warned that that odious and abominable sin of witchcraft be not suffered to continue unregarded or neglected, unto the advancing of the worship of the true God. The extirpation of witches and witchcraft is a special service and acceptable duty unto God, expressly commanded by himself in Deuteronomy 17, verses 3-5. In the performance, therefore, of this worship, it is solely and truly religious to seek their extermination by these means and in that manner, which Almighty God doth approve and allow. Cotta wrote several chapters on how to detect witchcraft and illness, and his book went through several printings in subsequent years, and it was one of only many. Well, some 20th century witchcraft historians thought that, like King Charles I, the populace of England was generally unconcerned with witchcraft by the 1630s. In 2012, linguist Carla Seur's analysis of witchcraft pamphlets indicated that people still relied on the magistrates to bring witches to justice. And witchcraft historian James Sharp noted that pamphlet authors believed they needed to counter a perceived threat to the true faith from atheism, and consequently emphasized the reality of the devil by insisting on the reality of witchcraft. The early Stuart kings believed in the divine right of kings, and as kings and heads appointed by God of the English social body, the Stuarts' responsibility to the people of England was to protect them under God's scriptural law. It seems, I'm just going into this in my master's thesis, but at this point it seems probable that the lull in witchcraft convictions indicated to Reformed Protestants that the Crown was not protecting them, as commanded by God, from the perceived threat of witchcraft. Reformed Protestants believed that if one was not fighting witchcraft, then one was not on the side of God, the true king above all. If you weren't on the side of God, you must therefore be on the side of evil. At this time, I'd like to say that I realized that there was a lot more going on in England to produce civil unrest in the pre-Civil War period, but I believe this communal feeling of spiritual abandonment may have contributed to the subsequent alienation of a large and growing portion of the English population and contributed to a festering undercurrent of mistrust toward the Stuart crown. So what? Why is this work important? Well, it's important to me because I'm fascinated by it and I love it. But what does it do for history or the wider world? It was pointed out to me that the voices of those accused of witchcraft, who were mostly poor women, are missing from this history. The trouble is, those voices are absent from the record. As far as I can tell, the men that carried on the debate on whether or not witchcraft should be a capital crime never consulted the women they either sought to defend or condemn. Rather, they purposely excluded them. The learned physicians who administered the Royal College of Physicians seldom licensed female healthcare providers, and the one effort to license midwives was shot down. Both sides made decisions on women's health and wellness without the voice of women, and policy was amended and law implemented without the voices of those who would be affected most. The failure of those policies were devastating for women in the 1640s and 1650s. And we can look back at this with our modern sensibilities and comment, oh, weren't they so backward? And we can use this information to congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. Or we can look at current policy development to see how far we need to go, particularly in healthcare and criminal law. Who are we treating and why? And are we including women in women's health decisions? Who are we targeting and why? And have we really come that far in 400 years? Also, when I started this project in 2018, we were all innocently going about our business, unaware that a pandemic was on the horizon. During the pandemic, as we all know, a rift in societies around the world showed that a great many of us were wary of medical professionals and their influence on government policies around COVID-19. The harder the medical community pushed the science forward, it seemed the wider the ideological rift became. This history shows that if policymakers don't recognize that there is a vast difference in lifeways and beliefs between themselves and a large, well-established group who have developed essential versions of logic and reason intrinsic to their group, when a government attempts to push their version of logic and reason on those groups, they meet with resolute resistance, sometimes with devastating effects. This was the case with Charles I in his policy toward witchcraft. Let me reiterate, at no point will I venture to say that the skeptical influence of the physicians on the early Stuart kings caused a civil war to start in the 1640s. But I do believe it contributed to the descent into mistrust and civil unrest. We can't ask what might have happened if the early Stuart kings had recognized that Reformed Protestants felt vulnerable without the government's protection from witchcraft. What I can say at this point is that the king failed to recognize that his decision to listen to the skeptics and change the law, to listen to the skeptics and change the law so people were less likely to be executed for witchcraft may have contributed to a growing perception that Charles wasn't on the same godly side as the Reformed Protestants who believed they were in real, tangible danger from witchcraft. It was his job to protect his country from witches and witchcraft, and he let them down in the 1630s. So at this point, keep in mind that I have a long way to go on my master's thesis, but I'll attempt to try and answer any questions you have. Jess.
Thanks, Catherine. I was glad that you ended on commenting on a possible parallel between the period that you're studying and our current societal tensions. Could you say more about that? Is Calvinism implicated? I mean, Dar already gave a lecture on that.
No, it's not. It's really noticing that there's this rift, and people don't seem to be able to talk to each other. And I don't know quite what to do with it at this point. At this point, I don't really know what to do with it. I have a long way to go on my master's thesis and to think about this more. It's just something that I really noticed as I've been working and going through the pandemic and knowing this split happened 400 years ago, and it's happened again. It's this huge split, and it didn't end well the last time. I'm really hoping it ends better this time. So does that sort of answer your question?
Francis?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a huge subject.
It is.
And it will take you way beyond your master's thesis, I think. I have a number of questions, but I think I'll ask this one. In Germany, at the same time, there's massive disagreements between Lutheran theologians.
Yes.
Many Lutherans, like traditional Catholics, don't believe in the reality of witchcraft. You know, Germany is the center of the witch craze. In many principalities, there are very few witch trials because all the theologians think that witches suffer from illusions.
Yes.
It seems unlikely that there aren't similar disagreements among Calvinists. It doesn't seem probable that all Calvinists universally practice exorcisms and universally think that witchcraft is this all-pervasive reality, especially in view of Calvin's determinism.
Right. This is so, like you said, it's so huge. I didn't have time to really split things up. There are so many different factions and different opinions, and that's why I'm looking at this genealogy of different opinions coming down through the medical field, because there's the medical side of it where there are evangelical doctors who are along with the Reformed Protestants who still really believe in witchcraft. And there are anti-Calvinists in the Church of England, and there are Calvinists, and there are so many splits. At that time, it was like, it seemed like every 10 years there was a split. And especially in Germany,
Yeah.
there was split after split after split from the time of the Reformation, and it kept going. And the same was in England. There were so many different opinions on it. But by the early 1630s, there was this really strong faction that was really talking a lot about it. And that's who I'm really trying to talk about. And I didn't have enough time to really go into details. So I think with my master's thesis, I will be able to make it a lot more clear than I can in this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive field.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not so much that the Lord was an anti-Calvinist. He was an Arminian, you know, he
Oh,
believed
yes.
it was one branch of Calvinism. That,
Well, there's a real controversy about that now. Yeah, I know about the Arminianism.
yeah.
Yeah, that is really controversial now, and people are talking about whether they really were Arminians or anti-Calvinist, or what kind of Arminian they were, if they were Arminian, and so again, very complicated. It is a very complicated topic. So, did you have anything else? Anybody?
Well, maybe we'll give someone else a chance, then we'll come back to you.
Peter?
Thanks, Catherine. This was great. What sort of diseases, you mentioned a few of them, could witchcraft, if someone broke a bone,
Oh,
could
sure.
they blame a witch?
Yes, yes, particularly if it didn't heal properly. Yeah, so because, and it seemed like they blamed witchcraft for most diseases. If you had epilepsy, or your baby died of sudden infant death syndrome, if the neighbor came over to see the baby and left, well, they could blame that person for bewitching the child. And it was constant. It was a lot. And it was so rife. And I think that's what the Church of England was trying to prevent, trying to find a way to get away from it. And finding that the learned physicians who were educated elsewhere, in Padua in particular, didn't have that opinion. They weren't trying to blame witchcraft on disease, especially by the beginning of the 17th century. So yeah, it was common.
If we had one more hand perhaps in the room, and then we can go to see if there's any, I think there was one question online, is that right?
Thanks for this.
No, actually, the Zoom audience can't hear you unless.
Oh, the Zoom audience can. Zoom is bigger than us, I guess. Okay, so kind of weird echo there. Thanks for this. I think that you're on to something with these Padua physicians, and that's very valuable. But I think you're far too easy on Charles I, who you're making, and you just sort of pass off as well. It's true he wasn't very politically effective, but that politics and religion were intimately linked, and it was the intolerance. Let's underscore this. It was the intolerance of Charles and the intolerance of William Laud, whether we call him Laudian or Arminian. Their intolerance fueled the Puritan movement, if we want to use that term, in the 1620s and 1630s. Many who were dead center Protestants under Elizabeth found themselves castigated as radicals. And use the word fundamentalist, which isn't a term contemporaries use. They also don't use the term Calvinist, right? Most Reformed Protestants did not consider themselves in England to be followers of Jean Calvin, right? Differed with him in some very important ways. So I'm wondering if it might not be more balanced to look at ways in which Charles fostered a climate of religious intolerance, because I think that's crucial, and whether you might want to look more at the legal framework, because another way of thinking about your evidence is to say it's not so much that there's a lull in witchcraft, persecutions, but that you have a couple of bumps, right? You have the Lancashire episodes, and then you have the huge explosion, it's true, during the War of the Three Kingdoms. But other than that, England has a very low level of persecution. I mean, very low compared to the German case that was just introduced, where Lutherans and Catholics both, by the way, on both sides of that confessional divide, are murdering women at an appalling rate, right? I mean, that's happening with great regularity in Germany in the second half of the 60s. So why not put more emphasis on the legal system, and why give Charles I such a free pass on his role with exacerbating?
Yeah.
religious.
Again, I don't have time to go into it with this, but I do understand that there were a lot of problems with Charles I. I really understand that. And in my thesis, in my written work, that really does show. So I just can't go into it in enough depth in a presentation like this. So I do understand, and there are whole chapters on the problem with his religious his religion. So what I'm really focusing on with this is just the witchcraft, but I do understand the rest of the problems with him, absolutely. Yeah.
Like wanting to ask it himself.
We can try, you could ask him to unmute.
Hi, Catherine. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay.
Sorry, we can't hear you online, unfortunately. So if you
Okay.
can type
Yeah,
your question into the chat, we'll try to ask Catherine. Sorry about that.
Yeah, the microphone.
I'll maybe ask you a question while we're seeing if that
Sure.
works. I was impressed when you put up the slide that said, why is this important? A couple of different ways. There's so many ways that this is important there, and there are so many links with so many things. So you talked about how this was important to the early modern period, the ways in which cultural perspectives entered medical practice and vice versa. You talked about the exclusion of the voices of women in health practices and the continuing relevance to today. And I could think of a couple more that were really interesting, including the kind of historical moment in time from a kind of legal history point of view, right? Like there's so much going on. I was looking on my phone, when was Bonham's case by Lord Coke? Because of course there's an interaction between Lord Coke and Charles I during this period, where Charles, under this personal law that he's talking about, says, this is going to be the rule, and Cook says, no, right? You can't say whatever you want to. And it becomes this, I still teach that in my administrative law classes. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on, is there an angle that is most interesting to you of all those different angles? Or, because it seems like there's a lot of ways that you could go in terms of spinning this for different audiences. I mean, lots of people, I think, found it interesting, but is there an angle that's most compelling to you?
Believe it or not, the legal side of it really was great. And I was looking at I got a lot of the information that I got out of the history of English law. It was thick. So
Well, that is the right answer, by the way. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, no, it took me a while to find it, by the way. I mean, it was looking in the legal law, the law history, that I found the answers. And it was one of those yes moments when I found that, when it said in the legal history of the law that this applied to witchcraft. That was the aha moment, yes, I've done it kind of thing on my undergraduate honors thesis. So, but that really does, it really did, and how it all comes together with the medicine. I love science history, and the, believe it or not, the religious history sort of was kind of a side to start with, but it all comes together in this storm. And that's what really appeals to me, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so jumping, one of our faculty fellows for this semester is asking if you know of any scholarship from scholars who've done research on how many of the cases could actually have been true, or how
Oh.
that might, or at least have been argued to be true.
Well, if you ask the if you ask the trial, the judges, they would have said they were all true, right? The ecclesiastical elites were they went to these trials and they tried to convince the judges that it wasn't true, and they didn't get very far because the judges really they saw themselves as witch hunters, and they were determined to try them, convict them, and execute them. And yeah, I mean, for us, it seems very strange, but it is about trying to get into, see the perspective of those people at that time, and to try and understand.
Thanks, Scott. I think this was in a chart at the beginning. What are the ages of the witches just generally? Were they mothers-in-law or were they young women? And the other thing is, in the cases you found, is there a relationship between the accuser and the witch, the accused?
Very often. Either, well, not familial relationships, but very often neighbors or somebody that they knew. Yeah, very much so. Well, when I've been to the archives in England to find witchcraft cases, and some of the most interesting cases were cases where people, there was a house of ill repute in town, and they couldn't figure out how to get rid of this house of ill repute, so they charged them with witchcraft to get rid of them, and so sometimes it was an excuse to get rid of somebody you didn't like, right? But very often it was that my cow died and I need somebody to blame, and it was frustrating because they didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand the diseases that they were getting or why. And it was the only way to explain it for them. So. In my list, there are some mothers and daughters that are charged. I don't think there were any children charged, but very young women, 16 up to very elderly women. A lot of very elderly women, unfortunately. Widows and unmarried women. Yeah. 870 so far. Yeah.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. So unless anyone has a last question, I will show you the slide for next week. First, though, let me join me in thanking Catherine for what was an excellent and yeah, really a presentation with something for everyone, I think. So thank you very much for that and for how much substance was in that. It was really fantastic. Next week we have Philip Jenkins giving the 2022 Lansdowne lecture for the Religion, Culture, and Society program. So this is another exciting event. Professor Jenkins is going to be giving a talk on climate catastrophe and faith, which is in two parts. So the first part is next Thursday. It will be online only. And then part two will be the following Tuesday, also at 5 o'clock. So that should be another fantastic session, and we'll hope to see you all then. Thanks very much.